Thanks, Sandra. Good morning, all. I'm Gerard, as Sandra said. I'm the current and fairly new chair of the Financial Planning Exco, having taken over from Greg on the 1st of August. It's good to see so many of you joining for what is an important topic and for what our very good speakers will chat to you about in a minute. My job is not to take a lot of time. I'm just here to say hello and to intro it. We live in an interesting time from a regulatory perspective, as most of you know better than I do, and as all my interactions with advisors tell me on a daily and weekly basis. Some years ago, we got used to this idea of anti-money laundering legislation and terrorism finance and things like that. And we started getting used to that as advisors, and we started getting used to that as customers of banks who said you can't have a credit card unless you bring your utility bill. And we had to say to our clients, hey guys, the product supplier will not accept your application unless we send them an ID and the likes. And it took a bit of time, but it's interesting that the legislation, the Financial Intelligence Center Act that we first dealt with, has now settled into colloquial language so much that it's a verb. So it's not unusual to say to your client, I need to FIA you, as if it's something that we'll do to the client or with the client. The bank calling you up and saying, hey mate, I'm going to stop your credit card if I can't FIA you. And even the man on the street who's not part of this community will go, yeah, it's okay, I don't mind being FIA'd, it's not painful. The thing with legislation, and FIA being one of that, is that it typically doesn't stand still. It evolves. So as things go wrong, as the authorities see that maybe it doesn't work as well as they thought, or even if they see that it works a bit better than they needed to, and it takes a bit of too much time, and it's maybe a bit too compliance intensive, things evolve. One of the things that happened to us in the near past that everyone's very aware of, and it's an ongoing issue, is the issue of grey listing that the country went through. And we heard a lot about that, and government started making changes to legislation to deal with the impact thereof and to try and avoid it. And lots of comments were written about that. Some of the stuff that flowed out of that process naturally related to anti-money laundering and similar sort of financing and terrorism financing things. So what we've seen, amongst a bunch of other things, some changes to that Financial Intelligence Center Act, FIA. FIA is an act that is typically regulated by a group of people who sit in what they call the Financial Intelligence Center. What we sometimes forget is that our very own FSCA, whom we're very familiar with in the financial services regulatory environment, also plays a regulatory role in the FIA space. And we're very glad that we've got Michelle from the FSCA to chat to us a bit later about their views and their experiences. Another interesting thing that happened and was a little bit off guard for some of us, because I said legislation is amended quite a lot, evolves quite a lot, was a change or two to the Trust Property Control Act, which is not necessarily a piece of legislation that we see often changing. It's something that those of you are familiar with has been in place for some time. Minor changes happen here and there. It's not something necessarily that us as financial advisors worry about all of the time, rightly or wrongly. What's happened as an outflow of the grey listing regulation is that government, along with the Master's Office, has asked for certain changes in the Trust Property Control Act. So what we've seen is changes made that impact trustees of trusts. So that's very important to us as financial advisors, whereas on the one hand, we're familiar with FIA and we're familiar with the concept of asking for information to identify and verify our clients. We now sit with a range of changes made to the Trust Property Control Act. Some of us are trustees in our personal capacity on the family trust, my brother's trust, my sister's trust. Some of us also might be trustees on the trusts of clients. And some of our clients are trustees of their own trusts. So it's very important for us to understand that as trustees, or as our clients being trustees, what has changed in our lives? What is that information that we must now keep and gather as trustees? And very importantly, what is that information that we must pass on to entities such as the Master's Office, who looks after trusts in general? And quite a bit of that is new, quite a bit of that landed with us on the 1st of April this year, and it was no joke. And we hadn't actually had finalization of it a couple of days before. Similarly, the Master came out and asked us to report in what seems like not a very well-organized manner at all times, not a very organized system. So we're very happy to have with us today FIA van der Spy. I think FIA needs very little introduction. She's from a company called Trustees. I'll let her introduce herself in a bit more detail and talk about what Trustees does. FIA is well known in the industry for talking about trust items, for supporting the trust industry. She's an absolute expert in this field. So that's enough from my side. Thanks, guys. I'm so glad to see so many of you on the webinar. These are really good numbers. It's exciting. Good for the FP Exco, good for the FIA. So I'm going to hand over to FIA to kick us off on the track of the TPCA and the anti-money laundering changes as they pertain. Thank you so much, and over to you, FIA.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Gerard, and thanks for the invite to share some information with you. For us working with it every day, it's like second nature now. We understand it pretty well now. But when you start speaking to other people, you just realize the lack of information and the lack of knowledge and the lack of understanding in terms of what has to be done. And I often speak about the blind leading the blind, where we assume the accountant, the tax practitioner, the trust service provider, the financial advisor knows what they're talking about and can assist these clients. And I want to echo what you said, Gerard, in terms of, I think I'm speaking to two categories of people here. The first one being the people who are actually acting as trustees. Those guys are really in a very difficult position now, because you're literally open to penalties of up to 10 million rand or 5 years in imprisonment or both. If you are acting for a client, I think now it's becoming crucially important that you actually be transparent with your client and decide what services you're happy to provide, and communicate that to your client and tell them what you won't do. And if you don't provide a service, then your client's probably going to have to go elsewhere to go and find it, because it's just become too complicated for layperson trustees to do it all themselves. And I'm just worried from a reputational perspective. When you just look at the accountants, for example, there are hundreds of thousands of trusts sitting under the accountant's umbrella. Often, like financial advisors, they're acting as the independent trustee. Nothing has been done. The client assumes everything is under control, and when you speak to them, they say, no, my trust is 100% up to date, chat to my accountant. And when you speak to the accountants, they've actually never provided trust administration services. And it seems like all the evidence that we have to provide revolves around paperwork. And a lot of people are up in arms saying, what has government done with the recent changes that SARS has made? What is SARS busy with, asking all this information? It's as if we have to do new stuff now. What SARS actually requires is information as evidence that you are actually administering the trust properly. They've actually introduced very little new things. They ask for minutes, they ask for resolutions. Those are things that trustees should be keeping on a real-time basis. And I was at a tax in Dalba yesterday where I headed a panel discussion on trusts, and the comment was made by SARS, don't you think you are going to backdate resolutions and minutes and upload that with documents? We are using technology that can actually determine the date of creation of those resolutions minutes. That made me sit up straight, and I thought, oh my word, it's like Big Brother is watching you. So we are unfortunately going to have to get into a pattern, a culture of ongoing real-time trust compliance. And for those of you who are not independent trustees or trustees on other trusts, there is a responsibility on everybody assisting clients with their estate planning, with anything that may touch a trust or should touch a trust, to actually help educate clients in terms of what they should be doing. And from a reputational perspective, I really believe everybody, who's close to a client, where a discussion around a trust, are your, trust affairs in order? As a trustee, are you doing what you should be doing? To really have those conversations with clients and make sure we can assist them best we can with education. So having said that, I prepared a presentation, and we are going to just have a look. Gerard gave an introduction in terms of what has hit us, from where, when, how does it impact us? I started speaking about which hat are we wearing, because you act as a trustee, as an accountant, as a financial advisor, as a tax practitioner, as potentially an accountable institution. So what am I supposed to do? And unfortunately, with this kind of slapdash, too hasty implementation of the changes to our legislation, there's a lot of copying and pasting, and there is no kind of a central standard across the different pieces of legislation. And we brought it up yesterday again. We need standardization in terms of what information is required. And can't we just have in government a central repository of information where we report it once? Because that will surely help save us a lot of compliance effort and time, and to help us not make mistakes by having to report to different places, different information often. So it's really, really onerous and difficult and quite risky for somebody who is playing in the trust game. So we are going to at the Trust Property Control Act changes. So I hope my slides are moving.
Sometimes they're not. Yes, so I'm going to interrupt you. I did say if it wasn't moving along, I would just let you know.
Okay, cool. Now please help me. So yeah, we just tested it now. So for some reason it doesn't. Does it move now?
Yeah, it's not in full presentation mode at the moment for some reason.
Okay. Wait, let me just do it again. Sorry about that. This is Apple for you. I still love my Apple. So let's just, okay, does it move now?
So Bernard has recommended stop share and then I think go into full mode and then maybe come back in.
Okay, maybe that's what we've done earlier. Huh? So I go full mode and then share.
Then share.
You wouldn't say we've got a technology business. Right, so I'm going to go full share. Okay, now it didn't allow me. Oh, yes. Okay, let me just do it again.
All good, we'll get there.
Share screen. Okay. So
let's try it again.
Okay. Does it move now?
It's still not in full sharing mode. Bernard, I don't know if you've got a
Sandy, do you want to just share and then we can just move?
Oh, I don't unfortunately have these in presentation mode. Bernard, what was your recommendation? Sorry, apologies everybody, but we'll get this figured out in a seckie.
No, and just as I wanted to unmute, something's flying by the house. But I was going to say, Fia, what I would recommend is first start the presentation in the full screen mode and then click on share screen. So Alt tab between those screens. I think it's picking up it's not picking up that you're going into full screen.
Okay, cool. Okay, I don't know how to go to other screens here now. My word.
Apologies, everyone. And no matter how much checking and testing you do beforehand, stuff does happen on the day.
Yeah, and that's why I don't use an Apple.
Oh, word.
They break my brain.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just tested it now. Okay. I can't switch screens now. At the moment I'm on full. Okay, wait. Let's just try it again.
There we do have and then I would maybe go to slideshow and start it, B.
Okay. Does it move? No.
No, it does not like that option, that's for sure.
That's the only way I can actually get back in. Really sorry about that.
Well, I can recommend that you just click on the slide that you want to be on. It won't be in full screen, but it could work.
Is this okay?
Yeah, it is big enough. It's visibly we can see it. So yeah, it would just be a little different as Bernard recommends, just to hit on number 2 slide, click on it when you want it to come up in full.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, I actually don't know what it means. Hold on. What is this thing?
Okay.
Full on my end. Let's just go screen pointer options, use presenter view. Use presenter view. Does this make a difference?
No, unfortunately not.
Sorry guys. I don't even know how to get back to this.
Yeah, we appear to be looking at something different than what you're looking at.
We're big enough.
Thank you, Henry, for the input. It is big enough, yeah.
Yeah, it's big enough. Fia, in the meantime, do you want to send it over to me? I can also try and share it in the presentation version.
Haven't guys got the PDF you can
No, we've
share?
got a PDF version.
You can share that. You can share that.
Okay, so let's
Okay.
do that. Apologies,
Let's do that.
everybody. So I'm going to take over here and just call up that.
Okay.
Okay. There we go. You're just going to have to let me know when you need to move on from one slide to another. That's there we go. How does that look, everybody? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine, Sandra.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's all good.
Let's go.
We're all good. And now we're just going to unmute you because you've clicked all the buttons.
Right. Okay, now we can
Perfect.
go. Right.
We're
So
good
let's
to go.
begin. So I think Gerard has painted a picture where things have come from. I think there's so many people confusing in terms of the grey listing measures, what's been introduced, when it's been introduced. And a lot of people still say, because we got grey listed, you know, all these legislative changes were made. It's actually the wrong way around. These measures were implemented first in an attempt not to be grey listed. And unfortunately, that was not enough. So government had a great plan to avoid us getting off the grey list because we really got a bad peer review. And I'm sure all of you know that in October 2021, they issued their final report where they scored 40 technical areas, and they found only 3 of the 40 to be fully compliant. So here we're talking about legislation, and only half of it we were partially compliant or even non-compliant. And then they also scored us on 11 areas of efficiency of the implementation. So it's one thing to have legislation, but you actually have to effectively implement and monitor that and police that. And unfortunately, surprise, surprise, we were rated critically weak on all of the 11. So we were really sitting with a great challenge. And I had a discussion yesterday with the Mauritian guys, where I think the implementation, and especially as far as the trust world is concerned, because trust has been dubbed as the black sheep in the family. So clearly there they think we're hiding stuff, doing funny business, etc. And if you think of different countries that have also been grey listed, such as Mauritius, who actually had a professional trustee that actually provided as a professional service, and the layperson family members are not even trustees there, and they got grey listed. So it was actually relatively easy for them to regroup after they got grey listed and said, right, where did we fall short? What do we have to do? Let's all work together as a country. And they got off the grey list in 18 months. I can't see it. Yesterday we spoke about it. We had great plans to get off the grey list by January 2025. My personal view is there's not even a chance. The master hasn't even gotten out of the blocks. We're almost halfway through, you know, this 24-month period. So especially, you know, so they have amended the legislation now. Still not great. A lot of copying and pasting. The industry struggle to get to terms with, is a beneficial owner definition suitable in South Africa as far as the founders are concerned, as far as the trustees are concerned, because they're not going to benefit from the trust. So I think us as an industry are pushing hard to say, get over yourself. FATF gave us a definition, and that's what we're going to have to live by. They defined a beneficial owner as including the following roles, such as a founder, such as a trustee, etc., etc. So we should stop focusing on that. We should try to get off the grey list. So we got the legislation now. Even that may be weak, and there are kind of certain inconsistencies and shortcomings. We have to demonstrate that we are effectively implementing them. And I really believe, you know, us as a country haven't done really well, especially if you look at the implementation and the monitoring and education around what needs to be done. So obviously after October 21, we were put on a year's observation period, and we were hoping to get off that list. And we had time to actually address the 67 recommendations that were made in the final report. You can go to the next slide. So we made great progress in that year, and we know in late August, there was a raft of new amendment bills circulated for comment. They didn't give us a lot of time to comment, and I don't even think they really care too much what we said as an industry. And then quietly, on the 22nd and 23rd of December, when everybody were on the beach, I can't even remember the warm days or not, they quietly promulgated legislation affecting 5 pieces of legislation, which causes a lot of confusion, inconsistency, and now it is so far reaching that, as I said earlier, now we have to figure out which hat are we wearing. So by introducing the changes to these 5 pieces of legislation, including the Trust Property Control Act, the Companies Act, Financial Sector Regulations Act, National Intelligence Center Act, to name a few, they attempted to address 14 out of the 20 deficiencies that were identified. They reckon they addressed 2 of the 20 deficiencies by introducing that massive act, which nobody can even pronounce, or something. And then the remaining 4, they reckon they wanted to address to various non-statutory initiatives. Then a second round of assessments of money laundering taken place, and that was going to be a national strategy to kind of address these issues. And then the feeling was that there's actually kind of a broader political response required. We know with all the state capturing, etc., we have to demonstrate that we are doing enough to actually get off the grey list. And if you just look at our president with the Pala, I don't think it's a particularly good example of a country working together. So unfortunately, it's rotten from the top. So I think that is why we're struggling to get traction. And there's just a lack of energy of government collectively to actually get out of the blocks and address the grey listing issues. It's all politics again with elections, etc., coming up. So I think we're kind of seeing that this is not really getting particular attention, and it is pretty concerning. And we had discussions with SARS yesterday in terms of them possibly, especially as far as the Master's Office is concerned, try and step in and help with, putting measures in place to demonstrate that we are doing enough to get off this grey list as soon as we can as a country. Right, next slide. So in January 2023, this is now after the legislation was promulgated. So when somebody's saying, because we got grey listed, all these legislative changes were made, it's incorrect. And that is actually the cause of a lot of the issues that we are seeing, because what they've done is such hastily, what did not prove to be sufficient. So in January 23, they obviously assessed our progress, and of those 67 recommendations, 8 strategic deficiencies were highlighted, what we still needed to work on, and therefore we got grey listed. And then the FATF president identified certain key actions that are required. And the one word that we've all learned is the beneficial ownership information that we have to keep on companies, trust, and non-profit organizations. And that is but one of the issues I want to speak about today, because it's not just about beneficial ownership. It's actually quite a bit more that has changed and impacted trust specifically that I'm going to speak about today. Right, the next slide. So the 8 strategic actions after we got grey listed, there they are listed. I'm sure you've read it before. Again, the focus on the third one being to actually provide accurate and up-to-date beneficial ownership information. Now, look, as far as the trusts are concerned in South Africa, they actually have taken it to the next level in terms of up-to-date, where the companies, are allowed longer time to provide information at certain intervals. There was just no mercy with trusts. When you look at the legislation as well as the regulations, as soon as one piece of information changes that affect the beneficial ownership register, we have to instantly submit an updated beneficial ownership register. So it really annoys me, people running around trying to make a quick buck again, giving clients false sense of security by saying, "Hope we can provide the service, we do beneficial ownership registers for you, so we can tick the box." It's a complete incorrect message that we are giving. This is a real-time ongoing requirement. The day you actually submit the beneficial ownership register, the next day somebody's email or cell phone number or address changes, it is out of date. you are open to those penalties again. So we have to instill a culture that we have to keep this real time, on the go, updated on the Masters portal, which it's a little bit falling over at this point. And what's happening with the information that we kind of just throw over the wall remains to be seen. But I mean, that is literally what they require. Next slide. So a lot of us dealing with trusts, from one angle or another, get really so confused because the different pieces of legislation haven't been aligned in terms of what is required, the information that's required, when it's required. So I started a notion to saying, got these new FATF measures with the different pieces of legislation that affects it. So when you think about these new measures, which hat am I wearing? When you're wearing your trustee hat, that is where you are liable for those penalties. You have new obligations that you have to meet. Real-time, ongoing. So I said yesterday, a trust is a resolution. You will make sure those resolutions are done as and when it's required before you do a transaction. And they're particularly looking at those resolutions for distributions at year end. If they have technology to figure out you haven't done the resolution before midnight, the last day of February, you are going to be disallowed that benefit of having distributed income and capital gains to beneficiaries to pay less tax to the conduit principle. So the trustee has picked up a massive responsibility, extra responsibilities, but most of the trustees never even gotten out of the blocks. So they have never gotten from point A to point B. Now, all that was required with these extra requirements was to actually get us from point B to point C. The problem is now, most trusts in South Africa, because when you look at the layers of compliance, only about 380,000 trusts are registered with with SARS, and there are currently, we think, about 1 million trusts registered with a master. So we have just over a 33% compliance rate. And remember, every trust has to register as a taxpayer with SARS, and you have to submit a tax return. So those things were old requirements. It's not something new. So, and I think that is the kind of hysteria in South Africa. And now we're sitting with layperson trustees who were never told that these things have to be in place. When you look at SARS, it's obviously that the trustee or representative taxpayer. Interesting that SARS recently, obviously the focus is on the representative taxpayer. SARS could go after those people, and you need an appointment as a representative taxpayer if you've got an entity such as a company or a trust. But in recent communication, SARS would refer to the representative trustee has to do X, Y, Z, and then in brackets, they put trustees. So you don't for once think that the representative trustee is the one on the line. SARS would actually look at the entire board of trustees. So when we look at SARS, it's a trustee's responsibility to make sure the correct information is submitted. Now, I had a long discussion about that yesterday. Before trust tax return are submitted, we now have to upload minutes of meetings, resolutions, the latest trust deed, beneficial ownership information. And so, by the way, SARS is one of the entities that got access to the Masters portal now, whenever they ever get that up and running. SARS cannot wait to have access to that portal because they're going to identify all those 700,000 trusts that have never registered with SARS. So they're going to pick that up. But because SARS have got access to the Masters portal, they're also going to see what beneficial ownership information has been uploaded. So if your tax practitioner is sitting there in their dark, small little room under massive deadline pressures, trying to submit tax returns, they don't have time to run around, ask for minutes, ask for resolutions, become the ultimate checker, balancer, controller to make sure, oh yes, the trust we will meet every quarter. So do I have 4 sets of minutes? Can you see how ridiculous it's becoming? We are making the tax practitioner now a trust expert because they ought to know that they should check for all these things. And often that person is sitting under tremendous pressure, have to submit the tax returns. I think very seldomly there is a meeting or communication where it's been presented to the Board of Trustees. Here is the draft set of financial statements the draft set of the tax return that I have to submit on e-filing. now with the new requirements, here is my list of resolutions that, you know, I found or that I've been given that I was going to upload. And, you know, the trustee should actually approve that, as well as the beneficial ownership information. If that information is incorrect and you allow the trustee to actually step back and allow the tax practitioner to submit the information. Because remember, on the tax return in the old days, we signed that tax return as the representative taxpayer for the trust. Now we no longer do that because it's submitted through e-filing. So it is actually the tax practitioner who's got the code and, you know, complete the information on there. So you're actually authorizing the tax practitioner to submit it on your behalf, but it's actually in these capacities as a representative taxpayer. So if there are mistakes, they're going to come down on the board of trustees. And I think a lot of people lose sight of just how important that is. I believe the master is way behind in terms of what has to be done. So if you just have a look at the SARS, the requirements there, they're going to have much more information than the master can actually dream of. They're going to have all the beneficial ownership information. They're going to have the trust deed. They're going to have the letters of authority. They are going to have resolutions minutes backing up those transactions. So it is so important to make sure that we make sure that that information is correct, especially if SARS is going to step in and help us getting off the grey list and help us, you know, checking and balancing that we are doing what we're supposed to do. When you're an accountable institution, a trust service provider, for example, or an accountant, and remember that Schedule 1 has been expanded substantially. I'm sure Michelle's going to speak about that. It's not just your bank. So we're going to figure it's not just the term. It is so broad now. It includes a long definition of the trust and company service providers. So if you draft a trust deed in your capacity, you do that as a business, and you know, that is obviously the focus. You do it as a business, then you're going to be required to register as an accountable institution. If you just draft a trust deed, or you put a structure together, or you advise, luckily the accountants recently got off the hook. They said if you just compiling, you literally just take a set of information, you put it on paper and you submit. Clearly, you know, they don't envisage that, where initially they envisage all the accountants to be part of it, whether you're tax practitioner or not. That was obviously a little bit overboard. But when you're accountable institution, you know, we will see now what different information you're going to have to enter there then as well. Okay, next slide. There's a lot of false prophets running around. It's unbelievable, all this, you know, the so-called facts that people make up, such as the master's not ready. We don't have to submit as long as you keep the information as trustees. You know, you off the hook because of the security issues with the master's portal. We're not going to submit. We're going to retain it. If you advise your client, do not submit because the master's portal is problematic, you are opening yourself for huge attack. I would never do it, even though we know it and we think it, that the master's portal is not safe. It is required by law to submit those beneficial ownership registers. And I really believe it's up to the fiduciary industry to push hard to make sure that the information is treated with the necessary care, because we are sitting often with minors' information, etc. So very, very sensitive information there. A lot of people said, no, we got 6 months to submit. And I think a lot of people make the mistake to kind of group that with a new IT3T. For those of you who've heard it, that is where the trustees now have to report the distributions to SARS as a third-party data provider. That has got nothing to do with the grey listing. A lot of people say, no, because we got grey listed, now SARS is implementing the IT3T. It's absolute nonsense. But you know, that date is moving backwards, forwards. Then it's May, then it's September, then it's May, then it's September. It looks like they're moving it back from May to September. It must still be gazetted. But a lot of people align now the beneficial ownership information with that date. I mean, how crazy is it? Beneficial ownership information is a real-time requirement that we have to provide. And a lot of people say, no, we have to include beneficiaries who receive benefits. Absolutely not true. It's beneficiaries by name in the trust deed. If you're part of a class, do not provide it. It's not required. I don't want to offer information that's not required, because then you're going to get finger trouble, etc. You're going to get yourself into trouble there. There's the URN number that's on the beneficial ownership register. None of us knew what that was, a unique reference number that the master kind of implemented over the last number of years. It's certainly not a once-off exercise, as I said earlier. It's ongoing real-time information as far as trusts are concerned. It cannot be updated annually, therefore. A lot of people say, no, as long as we do it once a year, when we do the financials and the tax returns, not what the regulations and the legislation requires. A lot of people say, oh, no trust no longer serve a purpose. Let's just undo all the trust. I think you're undoing a lot of good estate planning benefits by just blindly advising your client to get out of trust. Especially a lot of people said, oh, no, South African trust, got all these new requirements now. So maybe stop a trustee and start it elsewhere overseas. Excuse me. The FATF measures have been implemented way back in other countries already. So it's not a South African government thing, these new requirements. It is an international FATF standard that we are kind of aspiring to meet. And then some people are excluding certain trusts. And I think that's where the confusion really comes in. And we'll have a look at, when you look at FIA, they actually exclude certain trusts, such as testamentary trusts and so forth. Now, when you look at the IT3Ts, again, the confusion there, for the IT3T submission to SARS on the distributions, they are excluding employee share scheme trusts. A lot of people say that now that applies to beneficial ownership information as well. No trust is excluded for beneficial ownership purposes that we have to report to the master. Not a dormant trust, not a passive trust, not a type of a trust, such as a testamentary trust, whatever. And I really believe there's some alignment required there as well, because now you see the hat story, in which capacity am I talking legislation now and what is required of me. Next slide. So I want to just highlight 3 changes that were made in the Trust Property Control Act. So clearly they introduced accountable institution and a beneficial ownership definition. Then Section 6 speaks about new requirements where trustees are automatically disqualified to act as trustees. So it's going to be very important once a master has got that register up of people automatically disqualified, that we can't appoint those people as trustees. Under the new subsection 10.2, and look where they put it, under trust accounts, where every trust has to have a bank account, under section 10, where a trustee now has to disclose their position as a trustee to any accountable institution with which the trustee engages in that capacity, and to make it known to that accountable institution. This is a sneaky one, so I don't know if Michelle will probably shed some light on that as well, because a lot of people in the trust just say, what are these possessing these people? Because the accountable institution knows, they're already reporting. They got processes in place and systems and stuff to actually deal and report on trust that they deal with as clients. Why on earth are they now expecting a bottom-up approach for the poor layperson boards of trustees to now kind of, start keeping record the thick flavor ones? So the one is, once you deal with the accountable institution, you have to let them know you act in your capacity as such, so that the Urmi who runs around trying to sell his house out of the property and deal with a estate agent who's now accountable institution, you have to tell that accountable institution, being the estate agent, I'm acting in my capacity as a trustee. And you also required now to keep a register of the accountable institutions that you actually deal with. So that is an extra requirement of the trustees. So a lot of people forget about those 2 thick flavor ones and focus so much on beneficial ownership information. And, needless to say, they place it in some really obscure places in the Trust Property Controller, kind of squeeze it in, under the trust account. And where we speak about the accountable institution details, that sits under registration identification of trust property, for goodness sake. And the beneficial ownership 111A, also they put under registration identification of trust property. So I don't know what it's got to do with that, but so be it. This is what we're sitting with. So the point here is the 10 million fine or the 5 years imprisonment or both, actually important to the 2 highlighted ones, the fig flavor ones and the beneficial ownership one just below it, 11A. Those attract the penalties and fines. that we may incur. So the focus is not just on beneficial ownership. The FIC flavor ones are actually, I believe, probably the more onerous ones, because that requires a lot of discipline from the trustees to actually have paperwork. The onus of proof is going to be, if FIC comes and they audit the estate agent, they're going to say, right, give me a list of your trusts, show me proof where this old woman, put it on record that I've actually acted as in my capacity as a trustee. So can you see, it's all about paperwork and discipline. I would not let a trustee run around if I'm an independent trustee, just to do whatever they want, and I'm taking the flak with, the rest of the trustees. I would have discipline in my engagement letters, tell them these are the new rules. You play by the rules. Before you trot around and speak to an estate agent even, you will only do so when you are authorized by resolution. So I, as an independent trustee, know what you're busy with, and then we'll keep that on record. And I'll have that in my engagement letter, that these are the rules. If you don't abide by it, you're going to have to indemnify me if that 10 million fine hits us. Once the old woman is actually interacting with the accountable institution, a second step of paperwork, put something on record where you actually tell the accountable institution, I'm acting in my capacity as a trustee. It sounds ridiculous, but it's literally what this new measure requires, that attract the penalties and the fines. So and then you're going to have systems where you track these things, for each transaction. We've got a business relationship. Trustees have to become a little bit of FIC experts now, which is quite insane. Next one. Okay, so yeah, when we look a little bit deeper in terms of the trustees' interactions with accountable institutions, I'm saying we're actually expecting the trustees to become a little bit of FIC experts now in terms of who are accountable institutions. What does a relationship mean? What does a once-off transaction mean? It's ridiculous. And then you have to keep a register of those accountable institutions, as I said, and you have to inform the accountable institution that the trustee is acting in their capacities. That is a paperwork screaming out requirement. So the discipline your engagement letter, the resolution of the board of trustees, allowing you to go and speak to that, and then clearly the second step that people must not forget, second piece of paperwork, is confirmation to the accountable institution in writing that you are acting in your capacity as a trustee. And then we must be very careful. FIC can now cross-check, between what trustees are doing bottom up and, with accountable institutions top down. So this is, again, a real-time requirement. It didn't give us time to do it once a year to go and quickly create a register. This is a real-time requirement that we're going to need. Okay, next slide. So where did all this beneficial ownership stuff started? As I've gotten over myself long ago in terms of trying to figure out how can we call a founder a beneficial owner in South Africa. They're actually internationally looking at a warm body, a natural person who owns or takes advantage of capital or assets of a legal person, and those who really exert effective control. So it's ownership and or control. And it's sometimes really difficult in structures to identify, the required warm bodies that kind of fits into this mold. So in the Trust Public Control Act, we now have a new definition of a beneficial owner, and they try to align that with a beneficial owner in the Financial Intelligence Center Act. But when you look at it, actually started with SARS some years ago in terms of Section 64D, where they refer to it in the context of a company specifically. So that is somebody who got the benefit kind of labeled, or, in the sense of a dividend. So there they actually started, with SARS as well, talking about a beneficial owner. And to today, we don't have a definition of beneficial owner in the Income Tax Act. They have just in the new trust tax return, given us a number of fields who they believe are beneficial owners, similar to the other piece of legislation, require different information, which I just need to stress. But there are proposed amendments now where they want to bring in the definition of the beneficial ownership, beneficial owner. The irony is it's not used anywhere else. They just inserted a definition. So let's wait and see what happens with SARS. But they certainly require information already on the new trust tax return. So when we just look at a trust, we've got these different roles that people can play. The same person may be in different boxes. So I think in South Africa, it's now no longer about, does this definition work in the context of a trust? We literally have to tick on a definition that's given to us. This is how the FATF define it. It's got nothing to do with economic benefit. So once you kind of get out of that, it's easy to then say, what is the rule? It's a tick box. So the founder is obviously the person who needs to relinquish control, so clearly you can't get economic benefits. Similarly to trustees, with ownership and control in their capacities as trustees, they can't benefit, other than if they are also a beneficiary. The beneficiary's got enjoyment, but now you're sitting with a discretionary trust, and we don't want to tell SARS, people are beneficial owners, they're entitled to anything, because then we're probably going to have tax consequences where the beneficiaries may be taxed on income and capital gains in the trust. The independent trustee, sorry for you, you are also included in it. It's not just the family members. So you are also a beneficial owner as defined. The trust service providers, they off the hook, because it is about the beneficial owners as defined. So if you're a trust service provider and you stuff up and the penalties come, or even the financial advisor, in your world, reputationally, there's probably a bigger consequence, but in terms of the fines and penalties, no. As I said earlier, they're drilling down to the natural person, the warm body, and trying to find those persons and try and get an understanding or picture, like who are these people involved in this so-called problematic trust structure in South Africa. Right, next slide. So you have to speed up. So I'm going to take 5 minutes. So when you look at, and I'm sure Michelle is going to speak about that, all these slides trying to achieve, and I'm sure you'll get the slides as well, just be cognizant of the different ways it's being defined. It's not a standard. It makes it really difficult. It may cause confusion. So both, Trust Private Control and the FIC Act speaks about natural persons who ultimately owns or effectively controls, kind of similar, as I said, SARS up to now only in the context of Section 6040 as far as dividends is concerned. They're only looking at a definition now. But when you look at the FIC Act, then they actually go and they specifically speak about in respect of a trust. Let's just have a look at the next slide, and the next couple slides are kind of similar-ish. So here, when we look at a founder, it always speaks about a natural person founder, and then clearly it's a legal entity. Oh my word, then, there's issues and people want to know why is the entity and like who are the bodies behind the entity. Go and find the warm bodies. So the mismatch in terms of the FIC Act and Trust Public Control Act, it's obviously the natural person if they are the founders. If it's a legal entity, look at the screaming difference, and you may not pick it up when you just read it. When it's a legal entity, you go and find the beneficial owner of that legal person. Why? You start over again. If a founder is, for example, a trust, you go and find all those bodies that I just had in the previous picture, the founder, the trustees, the beneficiaries. When you look at the Trust Property Control Act and the founder is a legal entity, all you go to the natural person who directly or indirectly ultimately owns or exercises effective control. So we're not going to everybody again. So very important there to kind of see the difference, especially as far as a trust is concerned. A company, it's still directors, shareholders, but with a trust, you have a magnitude of people. Similarly, for a trustee, the only difference is, this is the confusion. In the FIC Act, because we have trustees by the name, now if you look at the FIC Act, it speaks about each natural person reports to be authorized or enter into a single transaction or establish a business relationship with the accountable institution. So here we may have an agent, whereas we don't have that, in the Trust Public Control Act. A trustee is just a trustee in the true sense. If it's a legal entity, again, you go and look at the natural person who ultimately owns or exercises control. When you're sitting with the FIC Act, you go and drill down on the beneficial owners again. Okay, next slide. As far as beneficiaries are concerned, here, sorry, I said earlier, I thought I was on beneficiaries. It's the trustees, the beneficiaries, those are listed by the name. So, and that's the confusion, at the end is we don't speak about classes of beneficiaries when you look at the Trust Property Control Act. You stop with beneficiaries by name. Look what they've done in the FIC Act. They said if beneficiaries are not referred to by name in the trust instrument or other founding instrument, in terms of which a trust created, the particulars of how the beneficiaries of the trust are determined. So you have to do more work when you wear your accountable institutions hat. And that sometimes causes confusion unless you know which hat are you wearing, kind of in which role you are playing. So Trust Public Control Act, I'm not offering additional information, over and above the named beneficiaries in the trust deed. The classes is only if you're an accountable institution, you have to understand a little bit better how the classes are made up. Next one. Okay, watch out for the regulations. Trustees must do certain things. So in terms of what is required of trustees, a trustee you must establish and record the beneficial ownership of the trust. You must keep a record of the prescribed information, and then you must lodge this register. You can't see timelines there, right? So it's real time. And the worst thing is D, you must keep it up to date. So the master must then take that information submitted. They must create a register in the prescribed format, and then the trustee must make the information contained in the register, and the master must make the information that they keep available to any prescribed person. I'm not going to go into too much detail. When you look at the regulations, they only gave guidance, what must the master do when somebody knocks on the door and said, here, we're pitching up, we're authorized entity to have a look at the information in terms of regulations. What must I do? The trustees weren't given guidance. So if I was a trustee and somebody knocks on the door, I'll send them to the master, because I'm not going to, be open to abuse where I can't verify the person and it's somebody who's just interested to come and, have a look at sensitive information, etc., which they're not entitled to. Okay, next slide. So the master's got the system, and they integrated, implemented the system about 2014 already. They call the P system. So that is obviously the system that, they have on record, where they keep trust information since then in a digital form. And that is where the URN number also came from. It's a kind of a system generated number. So just for those who see the ICMS, that's the master's system when you're actually trying to lodge the beneficial ownership information. That is the system that you actually enter in there. Next slide. So the capture of the beneficial information is a very important role, because you, as the capturers of information on the master's portal, you actually have to make 100% sure you got a signed power of attorney allowing you to capture the information. Without that, you're not allowed to do it, and the trustees will hold you liable if they're going to pick up that 10 million fine, as a result of you providing incorrect information, potentially. So then you are required to confirm in a declaration when you submit the information that the trustees are keeping in their records certified ID copies of all beneficial owners of the trust. And then you actually declare that you confirm that the trustees, if you are actually not one of them. So you make sure that you educated the trustees and they actually agreed to keep the information, that you are authorized to attend to and deal with this matter and verify the authenticity. This is the problematic one. If you don't have a proper digital FIA system, how are you going to say, I'll verify the information? I drove to the person's address to see that they live there. I phoned Home Affairs. I emailed them and I called them on the cell phone, each and every one. That is how you verify without the digital system to assist you. So the verification is really a big declaration that you are, giving as the capturer. And then you're also saying that the information submitted is true and correct. So you need to make 100% sure that you have updated information before you submit it. Because obviously this information that the master would then use, and God forbid, if that is not correct, and the master pick it up, or even SARS picks it up because they're now talking. So I really think it's really important to keep real-time information, to actually submit that to the master, and make sure you're doing that on an ongoing basis and having systems to actually keep track of all of that. So I think I've run out of time. So I don't know if there's any questions that we can quickly deal with, or, happy for people to send questions as well.
Thanks, FIA. My goodness, that was a lot of information there in a very short space of time. Thank you so much for all of that detail there. We do have 2 questions in the chat. I think I'll focus on the one, just bearing in mind our time constraints. And the question is, how much truth is there in the rumor that the conduit pipe system applicable to trusts will be abolished? Accordingly, all income will first be taxed in a trust.
Sure. If we reverse a little bit to around 2014, 2017, the Davis Tax Committee worked hard to get rid of the conduit principle. They hated it. And obviously the fiduciary industry pushed back super hard and said that the international concept, where that can be utilized, it is something fundamental to South African trust that can't be taken away. And there's been a lot of backwards and forwards, then it's out and then it's in, etc. So it stayed. And a professor told me, when you look at the policymakers, just, watch the green chairs. They've all been given trusts when they put into a position. So, a conduit principle is a really favorable provision that we have in South Africa. So they haven't taken it away. It hasn't come up for discussion again. However, I want to warn, remember, trust is taxpayer of last resort. So without going into too much detail, the trust pays tax on whatever is left. The very first rule trumpeting all other rules is we have to attribute. In other words, anybody putting an interest-free or low-interest loan into putting assets, with an interest-free loan into a trust, those people get taxed first on income and capital gains generated in the trust before we even think about distributions. And SARS now are enforcing those because they don't want the accountant to distribute all the income to the minor beneficiaries who don't pay any tax. So they're enforcing the attribution rules. And in the new tax return, they ask these uncomfortable risk questions. So yesterday we spoke about the whole notion of, if people have to come clean for the first time that, oops, the father was supposed to pay taxes on all the income and capital gains in the trust, instead of distributions being made to the children and there was no tax declared, so SARS out of pocket, maybe look at a voluntary disclosure program, because you are going to be burning. So it's time to come clean. They force you to come clean. So just for those of you dealing with clients with these uncomfortable loans, get a voluntary disclosure program going, because the moment SARS knocks on your door with an audit, it's too late. And the requirement is you have to submit all the tax returns. You have to be up to date. So it's a tricky one where you're going to need professional advice, but people are running out of time. So just as a warning, those usual interest-free loans or soft loans, be mindful that there's a worse taxing event than the conduit principle that people so abused.
No, no problem. Thanks, Michelle, and over to you.
Yeah, it sounds clear. It's all good.
Okay, now excellent. So now you can start the presentation so long. We do have quite a bit of an agenda today, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat some of the things the previous presenter has addressed. But certainly the intention is today to go through some of the, I don't want to say most important, they're all important, but some of the more significant amendments to the Financial Intelligence Center Act with you, and to perhaps clear up some of the questions in your mind about the expectations from us as a supervisor. So on the agenda today, on my side, the slides are a bit slow, but we're going to touch quickly on the General Laws Amendment Act, and in particular then focus on the FIC Act amendments. In terms of the expectations from the FSCA as a supervisory body, we will discuss business risk assessments, RMCPs, and then, of course, look at beneficial ownership, CDD, and later on we will also touch on enforcement as well as grey listing. So let's start with the General Laws Amendment Act. Again, I'll do this high level because the previous presenter has already touched on this. So with the mutual evaluation preparation, we started way back in 2018. 2019, the mutual evaluation was conducted, and the mutual evaluation focused on both technical compliance as well as effectiveness. So the technical compliance is our regulatory regime, our laws, and apologies, there were obviously shortcomings, as was highlighted earlier this morning. And as we know, taking legislative changes through the parliamentary process is quite cumbersome, and it takes a lot of time. And as a result, National Treasury made the decision to put everything that needed to be urgently amended into one bucket, and I called it the General Laws Anti-Money Laundering and Combating Terrorism Financing Amendment Bill. And yes, not all of us were lucky enough to have cocktails on the beach in December. We had to work, and the president then signed this bill into law on 29 December and it was published. So it touches on 5 pieces of legislation. As mentioned already, the Trust Property Control Act, Non-Profit Organizations Act, FSR Act, the FIC Act, and the legislation enforced by the SIPC. So today, in terms of our discussion, we'll be specifically looking at the changes to the Financial Intelligence Center Act. Please, next slide, please. Next slide. Right, so this slide really just shows you very high level. Not all the amendments are included here. If we have a discussion just on the amendments, I'm going to entertain you for a whole day probably. So what I've included here is very high level in terms of the appropriateness for our discussion today. The FIC Act has been amended quite a few times, in fact. Most significantly, the last 2 amendments were in 2017 and then again in 2022. 2017 was the significant and very decisive move away from rules-based to risk-based approach. And then in 2022, as I've mentioned, was to remediate technical compliance issues that was identified in the mutual evaluation report. So we are going to touch today, as we discuss, the amendments in relation to the definitions of beneficial owners, politically exposed persons, proliferation financing, and then as well amendments to customer due diligence. This will come through in the discussion today. And very importantly, also the amendments that relate to risk management and compliance programs, as well as new offences that have been introduced that were previously not part of our technical compliance AML regime. Next slide, please. Right, so all of you sit and wonder what you can expect from the supervisor. What do we want you to do in practice? It's very easy for government to tell you that there's new laws and new requirements that you have to abide by, but the question is always in practice, how do I do this? And it's very difficult for a supervisor to tell you exactly what to do or how to do it, rather, because we have to remain impartial. But hopefully today we can shed some light on some of those questions that you may be harboring. So a risk-based approach, very significant. It applies to jurisdictions and competent authorities like ourselves as the FIA, as well as you, the accountable institution. And we all have to identify and assess and understand the ML, TF, and PF risks that we are exposed to on a national, a sectoral, and an institutional level. A risk-based approach obviously implies that there must be a differentiation in terms of how we deal with the risks that we identify. So we can't deal with risk, every single risk, the same way anymore. Now, to that extent, you are in the position to identify your risk and decide the kind of customer due diligence that you will apply, be that simplified or standard or enhanced, and move away from the rules-based approach. There ironically are still some rules in the FIC Act that's not left for your discretion, such as the requirement or the prohibition rather to deal with an anonymous person or a person with a fictitious name. So be that as it may, that's the baseline, but the extent to which you understand the risk and how you control and mitigate the risks is all going to be subject to your unique business and not that of the business of the friend that's in the same street or suburb as you. So we cannot rely on a one-size-fits-all approach anymore. It really has to be custom to our specific businesses and understanding of risk. what is important to note is if you don't understand the risks, you will not be able to respond in a manner that is commensurate. And that is then the basis that's your starting block. Next slide, please. So what does all that mean to you? You have the requirement in the industry that you operate in the non-bank financial services, as supervised by the FSCA for AML CFT purposes, to stay abreast of changes to the FIC Act. And that's not always easy to do, but opportunities like today give you a chance to familiarize yourself and to become aware of what the changes are and how it impacts you. So when there are changes to legislation, such as the FIC Act, you are required to revisit your risk management and compliance program. The FIC Act says that you have to frequently, so that's the word it used, frequently review your RMCP, your risk management and compliance program. And at the very least, that would then include when there are changes either to your risk environment or when you find that the controls you implement are not effective. And similarly, when there are changes to the FIC Act. Some of the significant changes, and I say some because there are quite a few, but some of the significant amendments to the FIC Act that came into force in December 2022 relates to not the changes to both the naming convention and the definition of politically exposed persons, be they foreign or domestic. And what that means essentially for you in practice is not just to take note of that and write up in your RMCP that there's now a new definition. You have to go and apply that new definition to your customer base and see whether persons that are in your customer base or potential clients you're currently considering onboarding, they may in the past not have been included in the new definition, but they may well now be actually a politically exposed person, be it foreign or domestic. So you need to go and assess your client base as a result of this particular change to the FIC Act. Similarly, the changes to the definition of beneficial ownership. A lot has been said about this already this morning. And in a nutshell, really, you have to look for the ultimate beneficial owner, who is a natural person. Apologies. And in the past, since before the definition was amended, you may not have identified some of the people that are now actually, per definition, ultimate beneficial owners. So again, you have to rescan your client base and make sure you have identified all the beneficial owners as they relate to your customers that are legal persons, partnerships, or trusts. And you have to make sure that you then apply the appropriate enhanced customer due diligence on those persons. Remember also that when the FIC Act is amended and that causes you to review and update your RMCP, that update of the RMCP is then subject to the approval of the board and senior management of the accountable institution, because they are ultimately accountable for making sure that the FIC Act and the RMCP is implemented in the business. And one of the ways of doing that also just makes good business sense, over and above the fact that it's a regulatory requirement, you have to conduct in training to your staff on the amendments, because if they are not aware of the amendments in your RMCP as a result of FIC Act amendments, then they will not be able to implement it. So make sure that your staff training that is supposed to be ongoing and is supposed to incorporate and cover both the FIC Act and the RMCP, in fact, is then done as per the amendments following the review of your RMCP. Next slide, please. Right, so what is one of the first things that we expect you to do? You have to conduct a business risk assessment, an MLTFPF risk assessment on your business. I'm sure you assess many kinds of risks that your business is exposed to. But doing a money laundering, terror financing, proliferation financing risk assessment is going to put you in the position to essentially draft your RMCP. Now, by this, we're not expecting you to have a separate document. That this forms part of your RMCP where you describe your inherent risks. But this is not a step that you can skip. This is usually the step that is skipped when you use an RMCP template from your buddy, or you got a generic one from the internet or from someone, and it's not customized. So for you to have, you have to go and sit down and take time and consider what does your business look like? How big is it? What products and services do you focus on? What does your client base look like? The geographic locations and the like. What are the actual vulnerabilities? So those relate to the features and the characteristics of your client type, your product type, and so forth, that makes you vulnerable for the abuse of criminals for purposes of laundering money and terror financing and proliferation financing. There are sources that you can take into account and that you in fact should take into account, that being at the bare minimum the sector risk assessment that was done by the FIA. We've actually had 2 rounds of sector risk assessments. The first was in May 2019, if my memory serves me correctly, and the latest was in March and April, where we published reports in 2022. The first report was on the security sector, which also covered over-the-counter derivative providers, although they are not accountable institutions. And the second report is specifically focused on collective investment scheme managers and financial services providers that fall into the categorization of accountable institutions. Then there's also the national risk assessment. Now, the national risk assessment, for your benefit, there was a version that was ready at the time of the mutual evaluation. It was not published. We have since worked very hard to update that version, which is going to be published subject to some sanitization, and that is with the Interdepartmental Committee on Money Laundering to decide when that will be published. On the other hand, the National Risk Assessment on Terror Financing has been published last year, April. It's also available on our FSCA website. It is a summarized version, but for your benefit, we are also part of the drafting group that is reviewing and updating that National Risk Assessment. So when that becomes available, please incorporate. In the meantime, please do use the sector risk assessment when you do your own business risk assessment. One of the very important things that you should take from this webinar today is a risk assessment must be underpinned by the rationale for the conclusions reached. So as this risk assessment informs your RMCP, you cannot expect us to be satisfied with you telling us that your conclusion is that all your clients are low, medium, or high risk, or whatever combination of the 3. What we will expect you to tell us what made you come to that conclusion. So the rationale for making the decision that a customer is high, medium, or low risk. If you cannot do that and you just say, well, because I've known them for a long time, or you single out a single risk factor or vulnerability, for example, that it's a low risk product, that will not be acceptable. Business risk assessments do have to be reviewed in line with the review of your RMCP, because it speaks to one another, and simply because risks evolve. We live in an ever-changing world as risks evolve, and often mitigation efforts and measures become stale and ineffective because criminals get smarter by the day, and they know how to circumvent and avoid the mitigative powers of controls. So that brings us then to your risk management and compliance program. Next slide, please, where I want you to understand that this is a tool in your toolbox. So later in the presentation, I am going to deal with grey listing a bit and our expectations, the expectations we have on you as a sector and as on you as individual accountable institutions. It's essentially everybody's business and responsibility, and it will take everyone's effort to take us and keep us off the grey list. So the tools that you use in your business to help with this in a sustainable manner, one of those tools is your risk management and compliance program. So first of all, Section 42 of the FIC Act has been amended quite substantially, and your RMCP, when we do a technical compliance analysis of your RMCP, we're going to compare it to Section 42 and see where you fall short or where you meet the requirements. So you have to be well versed with all the provisions set out in Section 42 as amended. Then we believe that an RMCP it's a how-to document and it's a practical document. If it's something that you drafted, just in case we do an inspection, that you can give it to us, you can actually throw it away. This RMCP is supposed to be helpful to you. You draft it for you to help you to identify your risks, to help you to mitigate the risks, to enable you to identify and promptly report suspicious transactions, for example. So this is the effort that you put in for you. If you just use a copy and paste exercise, stating that you have an obligation to train and you have an obligation to report and you have an obligation to do CDD, that certainly is not a how-to document. It's not going to tell any of your staff who has to implement how they must go about these controls in your RMCP. So it does take some effort and thinking on your part, and no one can really do it for you because you are the single best expert of your business. You know your customers the best. You understand the products that you offer the best. So don't fall into the trap of following the generic route. It will fail you. And then just emphasis again that senior management must really take ownership and be familiar with the contents of the RMCP to ensure that it is appropriate, it's up to date, it's implementable, it is sustainable, and that it is effective most of all. And this is a very old requirement. This is not part of the amendments, but I do want to mention it because it certainly is something that is emphasized in the draft guidance note 7A as it relates to accountability of senior management and the board. And the provision in the FIC Act in terms of Section 61B, where senior management can themselves be sanctioned if they do not comply with this requirement. Next slide, please. Right, so there's a couple of slides here where I wanted to just emphasize in short the changes to some of the sections in the amendments in the FIC Act. So in terms of old Section 42 that deals with you have to have an RMCP, you have to develop, document, maintain, and implement it. The significant change there is it's been elaborated to very specifically include proliferation financing. In the past, it only related to money laundering and terror financing. But a definition for proliferation financing has been included in Section 1 in the FIC Act. And hence, your RMCP must very specifically now cater for that. So if in the past, you were wearing your money laundering glasses and your terror financing glasses to identify your inherent risks related to ML and TF, now you have to do that for proliferation financing as well. Next slide, please. Then in terms of 42.2, again, there's just the inclusion of proliferation financing activities over and above the money laundering and terror financing activities, in respect of which you have to make sure that your RMCP enables you to identify, assess, monitor, mitigate, and manage the risk related then to ML, TF, and PF. Next slide, please. Okay, there is throughout, and perhaps it's a good opportune moment to mention this as well, and to just emphasize what I said, that if you draft an RMCP and you just copy and paste the obligation from the Act to say that you must have a process or in place, that doesn't tell us what the process is. So be mindful where the provisions in section 42 still very much deals with, you have to come up with the manner in which and the process by which, on a practical level, essentially, your institution will do certain things. It's very important that you don't lose sight of that. So in 42.2i, sub I, the only inclusion there relates to whereas you have a situation where you have doubts about the veracity of previously obtained information. You'll remember then you have to go and follow all your previous steps applied. There has been an insertion here that applies now also to when reporting suspicious and unusual transactions in accordance with 21D. Next slide, please. Sub L, this was amended clearly because of the amendments to the definition of a politically exposed person, and then the new definition for prominent influential persons. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but obviously the schedules 3A, 3B, and 3C has subsequently also been amended in line with the naming convention and the change of the definition to these classes of customers. Next slide, please. So here is the long old definition of a domestic prominent influential person. And I'm so glad they've changed the naming convention, because I could never remember to use the phrase domestic prominent influential person. Next slide, just to show you the new definition. In a nutshell, so the naming convention change, we now simply talk about a politically exposed person, be they domestic or foreign. And what the definition then does is it removes the time limit of the period of exposure to a certain position in the political arena. Essentially, what it now says is once a PEP, always a PEP. And that's why I mentioned in the beginning, the pool of customers that you have may not previously any of them been falling into the old definition, but you'll have to go relook now because that time limit has been removed. Next slide, please. So the same applies here for foreign prominent public official, now called a foreign politically exposed person. And again, the reference there to the different schedules that has also been amended. You'll see it when you read it together. As far as I know, there is obviously a new definition for a prominent influential person in line with Schedule 3C, but that has not come into effect yet. There is certain determination still to be made by the minister in terms of thresholds. Next slide, please. Right, sub M. Important here, it deals with your enhanced due diligence for higher risk business relationships, but what they have done here is to also include higher risk single transactions, and it's not just now limited to business relationships anymore. Next slide, please. Sub Q. So the old requirement was that your RMCP had to be implemented in branches, subsidiaries, and other operations in foreign countries. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the amendments now deals very specifically with the institution will determine if the host country of a foreign branch, subsidiary, or other operation, so it's broader, permits implementation of measures required under the Act. Essentially, this deals with, you may have heard of it, in informal discussions, we speak of the hire of host country. So there's an interest from our side, if you have foreign branches or subsidiaries that operate and are in the borders of other jurisdictions, if they also have something similar to us as a FIC Act, so an AML regime. But even if the answer is yes, it could also well be that the requirements may be less strict than ours. So that is where we apply the hire of hosting. Then you have to make sure that they in fact apply the requirements as it stands in the FIC Act as well, over and above such other weaker requirements. Next slide, please. Q capital A is a new insertion. This really deals with the flip side of the coin. So where you have branches and subsidiaries in country, this deals with your group-wide programs. And to make sure that amongst the subsidiaries and branches, there is compliance with the FIC Act, there's an exchange of information as it relates to both CDD and transaction monitoring, and then obviously the safekeeping and safeguarding of confidential information. Here is something I just also want to highlight, that there may be still a misconception in the industry. There's nothing wrong when you're a part of a group and that you have these group-wide policies. That's all good and well. But where you have different businesses, specifically call it financial services businesses in a group, there would still have to be a level of customization per accountable institution in the group's RMCP. So although there might be a lot of overlap and also cross-selling in terms of customers, there will be differentiating factors such as product, for example. In layman's terms, if I can give you an example, if you have a banking group or a life insurance group that also has a stockbroker and has a collective investment scheme manager or an asset manager or a hedge fund manager, or just plain flat a category 1 distribution channel, might be same products but or same customers, but surely at least you can see top of mind, at least the product offering is different. So make sure that that differentiation is made. Next slide, please. All right, so here's a couple of slides on beneficial ownership. And because I want us to get to the practical part of dealing with the exercises, a lot has been said this morning already about beneficial ownership changes. And a big part of the reason for pushing so hard on the General Laws Amendment Act was also to deal with beneficial ownership and the definitions thereof, where it was not previously incorporated or provided for, and also to align, and not just align to the FIC Act, but then obviously ultimately align to your FATF standards. You need to understand that beneficial ownership, in a nutshell, it can be a very complicated topic. But you have to look for the ultimate beneficial owner, that is a natural person, and beneficial ownership relates to either or both ownership and control. The ownership part is usually not that hard to figure out. You can look at a share register, you can look at the type of votes, the voting rights and things like that. However, control is a little bit different, and we hopefully might be able to show you that with the examples that we're going to focus on. But I want you to, and these slides I'm sure will be made available to you. So as is the plea to revisit your client base to see if you are exposed to any PIPs, go and see whether you have any beneficial owners you've not previously identified to make sure that you are able to now apply the appropriate CDD. And again, this applies to legal persons, partnerships, and trusts, and the definition is very elaborative. I don't have to read it to you. You can read it yourself. It's really self-explanatory. So can we skip this slide and go to the next one? Okay. This really just emphasizes your duty to know who your customers are. You have to go further than identification and verification. You have to understand who they are so that it can inform your risk rating. Your customers must be risk rated. That's one of the first things that we will ask you, and it's the only way you can demonstrate that you are applying a risk-based approach. There's nothing else in practice that can explain why for some customers you'll just ask a copy of the ID, and for others you want the whole family tree and a DNA sample. And I'm being hyperbolic, but just to make the distinction. and that is subject to your discretion. Obviously, if we come to you and we see that despite the fact that you risk rated high, low, and medium, but now you do the same CDD in respect of all of them, regardless of the risk rating, that will be a finding. So make sure that they are risk rated, they are appropriately risk rated, that you have a rationale for the risk rating, and that you do CDD accordingly. And you have the discretion. In the past, under the rules-based approach, there was a nice list of things in the FIC Act that you can ask from a natural person and from a company and so on and so forth. Now you have discretion. And I also want to just here perhaps highlight, I find in many RMCPs that we analyze, industry still makes a distinction only between the type of customer as it pertains to being a natural person or a legal person or a trust or a partnership. But there can be partnerships that are maybe medium or low risk. They can be natural persons that are very high risk. And that distinction then doesn't come out. So the classification of your risk rating, please be cautious and apply for the characteristics of the customer, and not just whether it's a natural or a legal person. Similarly, in terms of geographic location, we find there's a very general split only between foreign and local. But surely a customer that lives close to a border or a very high crime area, or work there, or works in an industry that's maybe exposed to dual use goods or something like that, even though they're a natural person, that's going to have an impact on the risk rating. So apply your minds to that. In terms of high risk clients and obviously in terms of beneficial ownership, your legal persons, trust and partnerships, your customer due diligence is critical, and where you have to apply more. So you have to do more and do it more frequently. Please do so. We also find often that institutions go to all customers, say once a year when you review their portfolio or their policies or whatever product that you sold them. If that's your stance, you're going to have a difficult time explaining to us why you have once a year engagement with all low and medium and high risk customers. Then there's no distinction between how you are doing your CDD. Right, next slide, please. So this is not an exhaustive list, but I know that you guys like practical examples. So please don't take this as an exhaustive list. But when you look at who the beneficial owner is, and you look at source of funds and source of wealth, you have to find out, where does the money come from? How are they paying for this product or the service that you're offering? And examples may very well be someone's salary or a sale of a property or a gift or a loan or the lotto or whatever. But you have to assess that. You have to document the source of funds checks that you do conduct, and verify against original sources where possible. And there's, again, not an exhaustive list, but that may include bank statements, payslips, tax returns, share registries, royalties. The list is long. Keep in mind all the time that you're applying a risk-based approach. Where you have to do more, the verification doesn't have to be that intensive. Or where you have a low-risk client, you don't have to do that much intensive work, and then vice versa. Next slide, please. All right, there is, and I am mindful of time, there's 3 slides here that deals with additional due diligence measures that we can skip. I've now communicated the bulk of that with you, and I hope the message is clear that essentially you have to do enhanced due diligence measures, and that there's been amendments in the FIC Act that relate to this. So incorporate this into your RMCPs as you review based on the most recent amendments. And then I think we're actually going to start with the exercises. Sorry, I'm not near my other screen now, so let's see how this goes. Sandra, I don't know if you want to tell them how the polls are going to work before I take them through the examples, maybe.
No problem at all, Michelle. And thank you for hanging in there. I'm glad your voice is also hanging in there for us. Okay, so as Michelle has said, she's got a couple of things, and we did give you a heads up. This will be interactive. So I'll keep this up on the screen just for a minute or two. You obviously having a look at it, just apply your mind. Then I'm going to call up a poll, and then you can just answer accordingly. There's 5 questions that will be coming up. We'll work through them one by one. And most are single choice. There is one that has a multiple choice option, but you'll be able to see that. Okay, so that's from my side. I want to call up that first poll then. Michelle, back to you.
Right, so perhaps just a quick one. There's company A, that's the customer. It's owned by company B, it's a legal person, and 2 natural persons, Jonathan and James, 25% respectively. Company B, that owns half of the shares of company A, is also owned by a natural person, Amanda, who has 100%. So who's the beneficial owner, do you think? There is only one answer.
Michelle, I'm going to allow to run to see if we can get to about 50% participation, and then I'll end the poll and share. Okay, great. Thank you.
100%, 100%.
Yeah, we've got to 50% participation. I'm going to end the poll and then share the results.
Good stuff. Let's see what the audience thinks. So we have 27% for company B, 5% for Jonathan. There's a couple of people that thinks James is the beneficial owner, and then 66% thinks it's Amanda. All right. So the majority of you think it's Amanda. Next slide. Let's see if you're right. You are correct. Company B owns 50% of company A, but because it's a legal person, because of the definition, we have to go look for the natural person, ultimate beneficial owner. And because Amanda owns 100% of company B, and she's a natural person, she basically indirectly controls company A through her shareholding in company B. So well done to the 66%. Let's quickly look at the next exercise. Right, here we have company A. There is a CEO who has 10% direct ownership. There is a legal person, company B, with 60% ownership, who in turn is 100% owned by Mpho. Then we have Jacob with 20 and Sally with 20. Who do you think is the 100% or is the ultimate beneficial owner here? Is it the CEO or company B or Jacob or Sally or Mpho? Okay, the poll is in. So some people think it's the CEO, there's 5%. Some people think it's company B, the legal person. Few thinks it's Jacob or Sally, and then 81% thinks it's Mpho. So just so that you have a quick look again at the scenario, we can go to the next slide to see who was right. Right, so the correct answer is Mpho. And because company B owns 60% of company A, it's most of all the individual shareholders, but still company B is a legal person. Remember, we have to then, if there's a legal person who is an owner of another legal person, we have to go look who's the natural person above who ultimately owns. So here, Mpho owns 100% of company B. She's a natural person and therefore indirectly controls company A. The reason we have included the CEO here is very often we see there's an automatic default to CEO. And that is not necessarily the way you should go. You do this through a process of elimination. You start with ownership, and if still you cannot then find an ultimate beneficial owner who's a natural person, apologies for the coughing, then you might want to then put that title on the CEO, but don't just automatically default to them. Third exercise, next slide, please. Right here, there's a lot of legal persons. There's company A, who's owned by two other companies. Company B with 49% shares, company C with 51% shares, right? Who owns company B? It's Dudu. So Dudu owns 100% of company B, who has 49% in company A. And Bongi and Patrick, respectively, have 25 and 75% shares in company C. Company C has the majority shares in company A. So who's the beneficial owner here? Let's have a poll and let's see what your opinions are. Okay, so this was clearly a bit more tricky, right? So we have 3% of people saying it's company B, and there's 11% who says it's company C. 46%, the majority of you thinks it's Dudu. 2% says it's Bongi, and 38% says it's Patrick. So there's a bit of a, maybe it's Dudu or maybe it's Patrick. So let's, please, next slide so we can see. So the answer is Dudu. And how do we get to that? Dudu has 49%. Bongi owns 25 of the 51%. And Patrick owns 75 of the 51%, which gives you a 38 and a 12.75%. And that's where I previously also mentioned the indirect control. So those of you who said Dudu, I think you are the majority in any case. You were correct. Let's quickly move to exercise 4. Here we have an interesting one. And I want you to make an assumption here. So company A is owned by company B 49% and company C 51%. In turn, company B is owned 100% by Jessica. And company C, who has 51% ownership in company A, is owned by Mr. X 40%, Mrs. X 40%, and Junior X 20%. But the assumption I want you to make is that Mr. X, Mrs. X, and Junior X they've entered into agreement to have combined control. So who do you think here is the beneficial owner? And this is a multiple choice one. So please go ahead with the poll. Okay, so majority of you saying Mr. X, Mrs. X, and Junior X. Majority of you saying, however, Mr. X. All right, and there's a 22% for company C. So let's quickly go to the next slide to give you the right answer. So remember I said make the assumption. The answer is Mr. X, Mrs. X, and Junior X. because they have an agreement to combine control through collective shareholding. And they are the natural persons that own company C. If there was no agreement between the three of them, between the exes, then the answer would have been Jessica, who owns 100% of company B, and company B has 49% shareholding in company A. Last one, we have company A owned by 30% company B, in turn owned 100% by Amy. We have company C, who has 60% shares in company A, owned by Rocky and Patricia. And then Amy has direct shareholding of 10% as well. So who is the beneficial owner of company A? Let's run the poll.
Michelle, I've got 2 Amy's there, but we'll just have to combine those percentages when I share it.
It's fine. It's fine.
Okay. I'm going to end the poll, share with you now.
Okay. Right. So there's little interest in company B and C. There's the Amy's there. Rocky has not a lot of attention, and there's a Patricia. So it looks like between Rocky and Patricia. Let's go to the next slide to give you your answer. The answer is in fact Patricia. And here's the reason. Amy had that 10% direct, plus she had 100% of the 30% in the company, right? Company C has the majority in company A, but it's a legal person, so we have to look at the natural persons. We considered Rocky and Patricia. Patricia has majority control, owns 60%, so that ends up to be 45% in total, the control that Patricia can exercise over company A. Amy is just a short step behind though. So Amy had the indirect 30% and the direct 10%. That's why Patricia is the clear winner. Let's go to the next slide. I am mindful of time. Right, so we've talked about the amendments to the FIC Act. We had a hard discussion about the expectations from supervisors on accountable institutions. Essentially, we supervise and we get judged on that by the international community. How you respond to the supervision and to what extent you change compliance behavior also significantly impacts whether we get off the grey list or not. And this is determined by immediate outcomes 3 and 4 respectively. One deals with supervision and enforcement, the other deals with what is called preventative measures, which is where you guys come in. All supervisory activities, most of the time, result in some form of finding that will always, 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 always require remediation. If the findings are, the areas of non-compliance are significant, there's a range of sanctions that we are empowered as the FSCA to implement, which could range between a caution, a reprimand, a directive to remediate, a restriction or a suspension of your business or a part of your business, and a financial penalty. We supervise and we enforce on a risk-based approach, and each case will have its own mitigating and aggravating factors to consider. So as long as you remember that at the end of the day, it's through remediation that we demonstrate that us as a country, this particular sector, are changing our compliance behavior. At the time of the inspection, you didn't have an RMCP, now you have one, and you've implemented it, and it's working to the extent that you identify your risk, you identify reportable transactions, you file them, and so forth. So your change in compliance behavior is an incredibly important pillar that this country is relying on to get off the grey list. Next slide, please. There's certain offence provisions that have been amended. One of them, this one particularly, deals with your targeted financial sanction screening regime. You can flip through the slides, please, Sandra. I'll be quick. One deals with having to respond to Section 27, Section 32 requests by the FIC. It's now a sanctionable offence if you do not respond to them timeously. Also, they took the opportunity to amend a flaw in the FIC Act. Previously, it was not an offence, a sanctionable offence, if you did not file an STR. Now it is. So make sure that these offence provisions are filtered into your review of your RMCPs and your actual implementation of policies and procedures. We can go to the slide, Sandra. Okay, let me quickly deal with this. There are some case studies and appeals that deals with sanctions specifically. Not all of them. I haven't sanitized all of them because they've been published. Some didn't lead to a sanction, or it's not been published yet, so I sanitized. But this is just to show you what we deal with on a daily basis. The first instance, we conducted an inspection. There was an RMCP, but it didn't cover everything that the institution was doing in practice. If what you're doing is not documented and what you documented is not what you're doing, there's a disparity or discrepancy, it's going to be a problem. This institution remediated, showed us evidence of the remediation, and there was no sanction issued. Then we had a case, because this was published, you can go look this up. We issued a sanction against Ravensburg. After many attempts of redoing the RMCP, still didn't meet the requirements. It was a sizable sanction, financial penalty. There was an application for an appeal against the quantum, and parties, the FSCA and the institution, agreed to settle, and the settlement was made a decision of the appeal board. That also mean that the rest of that sanction that has been suspended, if we find in the next 3 years that that institution commits that non-compliance again, that suspended sanction becomes payable. The last one, this was actually our first appeal that went before the appeal board. It was on the 15th of June, that recent. The sanction was in respect of RMCP, CDD, and sanction screening. You can see it was quite a sizable financial penalty. The institution appealed against the quantum, and the appeal board ruled in the FSCA's favor. Unfortunately, the appeal board in its ruling did not deal with all the technicalities and arguments put before it, but just for your benefit, the arguments also related to FATF recommendations and the impact of global AML requirements and the adherence on ground level by institutions in our country to those recommendations. But this, I think this has been published by now. You're welcome to go and have a look at that on our website. Next slide, please. And I promise you we're nearly finished. I don't want to lose all of you because of time. Again, I'm not going to go through a lot of this because the previous presenter mentioned, you know there was a mutual evaluation. You know that we've been grey listed after post-observation period that was discussed with the reviewers in January in Morocco this year. We are working hard to supervise you better, to supervise you more effectively, and to deal with remediation and enforcement monitoring more effectively. But at the end of the day, we also use opportunities like today to create awareness. We have changed a lot in our approach to supervision. We do joint inspections with the Prudential Authority, with the Financial Intelligence Center. We share a lot of information with them, all to help you in the IO4 space to understand and mitigate your risks better. And there are several tools, guidance products available to you by the FATF, by the FIC, by ourselves, for you to make use of. And same applies to industry bodies like FIA and others, and compliance practices. Everyone is trying to help. If you are open to it, it will assist you. If you're not open to it, if you don't want to make that effort, you're going to lose out on the benefit of the knowledge that's shared, often in plain language, and to make things more understandable. What can you do to help this country get off the grey list is on the next slide, and we're very close to finish. So you need to understand your MLTFPF risk so that you can mitigate it. You have to apply a risk-based approach. You have to risk rate your customers. You must identify your beneficial owners and apply enhanced customer due diligence. You have to know who the PEPs are in your client pool and apply appropriate CDD to them. You have to review your risk and your mitigative controls because this environment changes and you will be left behind if you don't keep up with it. You have to identify and file reportable transactions and activities. There is timelines in the regulations, but if you read those carefully, it says as soon as possible, but not later than a certain timeline, be that the 15, the 5, or the 2 days. Essentially, your obligation is to file as soon as possible, and we will test this when we do on-site inspections and other supervisory engagements. We're going to ask you, show us when you identified this reportable transaction activity. How long did you take to file it? Has the filing of the report been adequate and successful? If it's been rejected, did you remediate the rejection? If you failed to report in time or at all, did you follow Directive 3? So we're not necessarily going to look at the content of your filings, but we're going to look at whether your policies and processes you have in place are enabling you to file according to what you should be filing. Be conscious and respond to guidance and directives issued. It's only going to help you. Remember that your board and senior management has accountability, and please take remediation of findings seriously. Next slide, please. There's a couple of sources in here. What I did not include when I prepared this presentation, we have not Friday, last Friday, the Friday before, we have sent out communication 22 of 2023. It's a money laundering webinar, CPD accredited. Please go and watch it if you have not done so yet. We are aware that there's a couple of people that have difficulty with the CPD certificates. We're working on that. That's not included in this slide, but it's in a separate communication. Please go and have a look at that. And then lastly, next slide, we have a website. When you look at the gray banner, it says regulatory framework. When you click on that, you'll see what's on the next slide. There's a blue box that says anti-money laundering. When you click on that, you'll find the sector risk assessments, the TF risk assessment, communication. You will find the body of knowledge. You will find all the sanctions we've issued. You will find a lot of information that can help you there. So please go and have a look at that. And we are revamping that to keep it fresh and accurate for you. With that, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm sorry I'm 9 minutes over time. Thank you for your attention and your patience, especially with a glitch in the network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I can only again thank you for your time, effort, and energy. It's an extremely informative presentation. I think the introduction of the polls was something we had asked you specifically to include. I think it's great to make people think. I know Brad and I had attended a session some time ago where the polls were included, and I can put my hand in my heart and confess that Brad and I both got things wrong. It's not an easy challenge, but it does give you an opportunity to actually consider what you need to look at within your businesses. So thanks for taking everyone through that so well, Michelle, and also for sharing the resources that are available to members. We know they are there. We try and remind everyone that they are, but it is a very, very valuable resource. So thank you once again so much for your time and your input today.